Today's scripture reading is from Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 15 through 20. Moses continued, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your fellow Israelites. You must listen to him, for this is what yourselves requested of the Lord your God when you were assembled at Mount Sinai. You said, 'Don't let us hear the voice of the Lord our God anymore or see this blazing fire, for we will die.' Then the Lord said to me, 'What they have said is right. I will raise up a prophet like you from among their fellow Israelites. I will put my words in his mouth, and he will tell the people everything I command him. I will personally deal with anyone who will not listen to the messages the prophet proclaims on my behalf. But any prophet who falsely claims to speak in my name or who speaks in the name of another God must die.'"
May the words of my mouth and the meditations of each of our hearts be with you, O gracious God. Amen. Have any of you started, I'm not going to say how many of you have read the Bible. How many of you have read the Bible starting from the beginning? You're working on that now? I remember getting my first Bible that I really remember when I was 16 for my 16th birthday. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna start from the beginning and I'm gonna read all the way through, and Genesis was good and I was feeling good about myself. Why are you giggling? Do you know how the story's gonna go? Okay. Genesis, you're like, oh, this is beautiful, this is neat, this is exciting, and you start getting excited for the next. You get through Exodus, there's so many great stories. This is like with the stories that if you don't know the Bible even, you kind of know the stories of Exodus, right? Like they were slaves and then they are out in the wilderness, and so you're like getting the finer details of the story. Leviticus, you're like, well, this is really boring. It's like the credits of the Bible, right? Like, on a movie where it's just reading the credits and you're like, okay, well, I can skim most of that. And Numbers starts getting a little bogged down, but there's some good stuff in there. And so you get to Deuteronomy and then you're like, I'm done. This is just repeat but law, and it's Deuteronomy, we read the Bible, the way we talk about the Bible, we talk about it often as one book, but really they're named different books in the Bible. They're all their own separate thing, and they're in charge of different parts. So Genesis is really the poetry, right? Deuteronomy and Exodus tells the story of who we are, of the people. Genesis is the beginning, and then how we form as the identity is in Exodus. Numbers is just telling you how, it's almost the foreshadowing, right, of what's to come next. And you get to Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is the priestly line. Deuteronomy tells you the line of priest and who's coming from whom, meaning that this is a holy lineage. It's the ordering of life. If this happens, then you should do this. If Moses is gone, I'll rise up another prophet from amongst you. It's kind of the details of how things are going to go. And we are concerned about the process of this. It's the undergirding to be the understanding of divine foundation. Everything that happens is divine by God, and it comes from our understanding of what's come before us. Here's what Deuteronomy also does. It leaves open space for good sense and integrity and open citizenship, responsible citizenship, meaning it's not a list of do's and don'ts. It's here's how this will happen. Here's how this will unfold. So we hear about Deuteronomy and the prophets, and it made me start thinking, who are the prophets of our time? Silence. That's what I came up with too. I thought about who are what'd you say? Billy Graham, Martin Luther King, Mother Teresa. Some of those we have to go back decades to get to, right? But nobody I can point to in this time and in this space right now that I could look at that person and say, maybe they're a prophet. Maybe I just haven't looked close enough. But where are the great prophets and preachers of old who challenged the establishment and called people to faithfulness? To me, I can tell when a prophet is there because they hit something that's deeper than my own understanding, but there's something intrinsically that I know is true in what they're saying. Have you ever had that experience where what they're saying, you hadn't ever thought about it, but it is something right that happens? Martin Luther King is someone who I think of who's able to do that. Someone who is able to have a greater knowledge and understanding of who they were, but were connected to God in that. That through them, it's as if they're a stained glass window, and through them, you are able to see God more clearly. Some people, they struggle with calling prophets are celebrity pastors. Do you know who I'm talking about? Not who I'm talking about, but what I'm talking about. Pastors who are doing great work and in great places and are impacting their community, but there always tends to be a camera crew around. They're not doing it outside of the gleam of the cameras. And there's always something that makes me a little suspicious of prophets who are so well liked by people. You remember, the prophets were never popular. The prophets usually had to be run out of their hometown. Now think about this. They have seen these prophets grow up to be raised, and it's those same people who are running them out of town. Usually when someone is very popular, I have to think, is that what God tells us who prophets will be? No, usually prophets are despised and hated, spit upon. They are told to dust off their feet and move to the next town if they're not accepted, because prophets tell us what we don't want to hear. Prophets call us to be better than ourselves. Prophets tell us the ways in which we've fallen short and have fallen short of that faithfulness to God. It's usually a job description that includes loneliness, danger, purity, and truth. It's a hard job to be a prophet. Who can be a prophet? Anyone God calls can be a prophet. How do you know when someone's a prophet? That's a harder one. Well, usually they prophesy something that comes true, and this isn't in a fortune-telling way, like they can just predict the future, because we have lots of people who love to do that and think of themselves as prophets. But you have to first be called by God, and then you have to have kind of what I'm talking about, that intrinsic knowledge that almost hits people like a thunder lightning bolt in their body, in which God is saying, listen to this person. They speak truth to this time. They stand in the gap sometimes between people and God's understanding and our understanding of God's truth. Just like Moses. Moses also would have routine conversations with God. You see, prophets, you can't just be a prophet of yourself. You can't just be a prophet of the times. It's easy to prove that something will come true if you're just looking around at our times and looking at who we are as people and the history of human civilization. We can make lots of predictions in that way. But what prophets do, prophets must be in a deep and ongoing continual conversation with God. And here's the one that I think it's hardest for us reason for us to find prophets here and now. Humility. Prophets have to be humble. It's a difficult quality to find these days. So, you know what that means. Not all pastors are prophets. But all prophets, not all prophets are pastors, but not all pastors are prophets, and not all prophets are pastors, which means there's prophets in the pews. That means that there's prophets among us, those who give of their time in public service, advocating for the poor, calling their neighbors and communities to accountability through their deeds and work. Moses was able to show people God's love in the wilderness in spite of their insecurities and concerns. Remember, these are the Back to Egypt Club. We think of Moses as this great leader, but they were grumbling the whole way. They were complaining, like every day they'd wake up and remember, they're like, Moses, we don't have any food. So then Moses would make it literally rain food. So like, they probably didn't even have to get out of their tent very much and scoop up something to eat. Moses, we've been out here forever. And he's like, okay, let me go up to the mountain, find out the plan, work it out. Moses did not have an easy job at all. Moses' job was hard. And it wasn't just that he had the divine knowledge that God had given him. He's fighting with the people to just barely get them to come along. And half of them are going, let's just go back to Egypt, man. I mean, there we knew what we were up against. You have to have a strong relationship with God. So where have all the prophets gone? Do you think they've stopped living here in this time and in this place? Yes? No? Yes? No? Yes and no? I believe God will always provide prophets as long as God is speaking to the world. And I believe God still has something to say to this time and in this place. I believe God is still speaking. So where have the prophets gone? Perhaps they're too busy and they're in the streets and in soup kitchens, homeless shelters, halls of justice, and government. Where have all the prophets gone? Maybe the prophets stopped preaching because they were concerned about challenging the belief and the worldview of others. They knew they would be criticized on certain news stations, or they would be chastised by their social clubs, and so maybe they just began to stay quiet. They don't want to be seen rude or impolite, to say things in mixed company. Or maybe they stay to themselves for fear of being wrong. You can ask Siri basically anything in the world and get a correct answer. The fear of the prophet is still present. You see, part of being a prophet is that you can prophesy what's taking place, what will come next, but it doesn't mean you have it all figured out. We've come into a society where we expect experts to have all the answers. So I can't believe that you're a prophet until you have it all figured out, have your plan mapped out 8 years in advance, and then perhaps I may believe that you're a prophet. The fear of a prophet is still one of isolation and loneliness, pain and heartache. Prophets are alone. It doesn't mean that they stop feeling fear because they're prophets. It means that actually they're just called by God and not us. I don't know about you, I like to hear that I'm right. Just me, because nobody else has their hands up. I'll remember that next time I'm right. And I like people who tell me I'm right. And I like when they tell me, you know what, you are so right. And I say, I know I am. We all like to hear that. And prophets tell us actually the exact opposite. It reminds us, prophets remind us that we are all called by God. That we are all called to be prophets in a certain way, because we're all called to live a life that is set apart and different as Christians. We are all called to listen to God closely and intensely, living in a world that doesn't understand why we do things the way we do them. We live in a world where, as Christians, what we do doesn't make sense because we're called to do something set apart and different. We are called to live a life that's different than the rest of the world. Where have the prophets gone? I think when Moses is talking to the people, he knew it made them nervous to think that they would be out there without Moses. While they were grumbling and complaining, I would imagine that after the manna fell from the sky, they were like, yeah, thanks, Moses. That was great. Keep it up the good work. And went in and had breakfast. And they knew that Moses was a prophet because when he was speaking with God, things happened. Maybe not always the way they wanted, maybe not in the time frame that they wanted, but they changed. Or at least they didn't feel so alone. Moses reminds them to quit worrying. God will provide. Once again, God will provide. And as I thought about it, I thought maybe that's why we don't see prophets around much anymore. Have we all forgotten that God will provide? God will provide. Have we forgotten? We have forgotten that the prophet calls us to something more and greater than ourselves. God will provide, and God will provide prophets. Our job is to listen to them. A pastor friend of mine preached a great sermon. It was, out of the park. And it was church like this with a aisle and, shaking hands afterwards. And so everybody said that first Sunday, "Well, Pastor, that was a great sermon. You just hit home. It really just hit me in the heart." And next week, Pastor gets up, preaches the exact same sermon. And second week, people resonated with it. Maybe people thought maybe there weren't enough people there that last Sunday, so he repeated the sermon. Well, the third Sunday, he gets up and preaches the exact same sermon. So finally, at the end, while people are shaking hands, one person says, "Pastor, that was a really good sermon, but I think I've heard it before. You preached it now 3 times in a row." I appreciated it, but 3 times, Pastor? Are you okay? And the pastor said, "Well, I preached it 3 times because I didn't see anybody do anything the first time I preached it." We have to be moved beyond words and into deeds for God's great world. Maybe we aren't a prophet, but maybe when we can see prophetic work, we can support it. We can hold it, and we can be with those who are doing it. It doesn't have to be in the gleam of cameras. It doesn't even have to be on street corners. It can be privately, it can be personal, and it can be one-on-one. And sometimes the beginning of changing lives happens first and foremost with those who are gathered with you. Amen.